as the principal, you're the keeper of a lot of secrets, you're the teller of stories, but you can't tell all of the stories. So you need to hold some of it back, particularly if you're trying to support a family. You don't want their story spread through the school. You need to keep their confidentiality and dignity of your staff, students and families. So keeping some of those stories to yourself can be lonely. So it's important that you've got some strategies in place about how to deal with that loneliness when it does tap you on the shoulder.
Welcome to another episode of the Leadership Conversations podcast with Jonno White. I'm Jonno White, your host, and today's guest is Gez Mulvahil, the Executive Officer of Australian Catholic Primary Principals Association. Welcome to the podcast, Gez.
Thanks, Jonno. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on, and I'm so excited to hear some of your story. First of all, tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are and what you do.
Thanks, Jonno. I'm a ex-primary school principal. I've worked in Catholic education for over 30 years. Following the principal's role, I moved into this executive officer role at the Australian Catholic Primary Principals Association. Let's call it ACPPA for short. It's a bit hard to get your words around all of those words as you go. So we represent Catholic primary school principals across Australia, so about 1,500 Catholic primary school principals. We have different associations across the country, so each state and territory has their own Catholic primary principal association. So we work closely with those associations to advocate and act for Catholic primary school leadership. It's a hard gig. I did the role for 8 years as a Catholic primary school principal here in Darwin, where I'm based. And it's really rewarding in my role now to be able to continue to work in the education sector and to be able to help principals who have an amazing job, but it's getting more challenging by the day. Before I became a principal, Jonno, I was a classroom teacher. I grew up in a little country town in Victoria. I'm the youngest of 8 children. Grew up in a Catholic family, so working in Catholic education was a natural progression for me to teach and to choose to work in Catholic education and to continue to be involved throughout my career today.
Amazing. And what town? Whereabouts were you born?
It's a little tiny town called Colburn, which sits between Bendigo and Shepparton, a town of only about 200 people. Mum and Dad had the local pub growing up, and so it was a really amazing childhood and to be able to grow up with such a sense of community within that little town.
It's funny because I've had, and I can't remember who it was to tell you the truth, but I feel like I've definitely had 1 or 2 people on the podcast before who grew up in settings where their parents ran the local pub. And I feel like there's always great stories associated with that. It must create its own kind of environment where you see and experience lots of different things that's unique. Yeah,
definitely no secrets growing up in a little town either, Jonno. And, having that connection through to, whether it was the sporting community, you played sort of tennis in summer and netball in winter, or the town Christmas carols or whatever it was going on, everyone got in and got involved. And that saying that it is the village that raises a child, it really is in those small communities where a lot of farmers within the community as well. So travelling around, you always had an extra person in the car or everyone chipping in to make sure people got to different events. And, of course, every event was very well catered. The local community always put on a good feed at every event too, Jonno.
Yeah, incredible. It's lovely to get a picture of your childhood. The other question I wanted to ask you, 1,500 principals. You were a principal yourself for 8 years. The question that popped into my head: what's one thing that we have a lot of educators who listen, but then there's a lot of people who have never been a principal. They might be educators, and a lot of people outside of education. What's one thing about being a principal that you think maybe most people don't understand or don't know about? Anything come to mind?
Yeah, absolutely. While it's a really rewarding job, it's also can be a really lonely job because as the principal, you're the keeper of a lot of secrets, you're the teller of stories, but you can't tell all of the stories. So you need to hold some of it back, particularly if you're trying to support a family. You don't want their story spread through the school. You need to keep their confidentiality and dignity of your staff, students and families. So keeping some of those stories to yourself can be lonely. So it's important that you've got some strategies in place about how to deal with that loneliness when it does tap you on the shoulder.
Yeah, it's funny. I do a lot of work with school principals or the equivalent head teachers, overseas. And I think one of the advantages, there's many disadvantages to not being local, because you can't just catch up over a coffee down the road, which is the ultimate, I think. But one of the advantages of being so far away is I feel like I can be particularly for a school principal, you've got your board, who often are parents of children who go to the school, not always, but often. And you're in this ecosystem where I imagine, particularly if your own kids are going to that school, or you've got a lot of friends who teach at the school with you, it can become a lot of your social world. And so having someone literally across the sea who goes, yeah, you can say, when you say that name, I don't know who that person is. So, and it's confidential. So I think that's where I have heard a lot of principals say that it can be lonely. And I think it's because of those different stakeholder groups, and you need to find those safe, confidential outlets where you can debrief things. Because so even with your board, you can't say everything, because there is that position where they're your boss. So it just means you want to be as transparent and accountable as possible, but it's not the environment to be able to block, just talk things out all the time.
Yeah, and that's where being part of ACPPA is really important, because you've got connections across the country, and while there's different regulations and different system controls in place, ultimately you're a principal in a school, so you can have some of those blurt conversations without damaging anyone's reputation, or it is good to have a whinge sometimes, Jonno, in a safe environment, but also to go with a solutions-focused mind, because getting dragged into that negativity of loneliness isn't a good option. So to find someone, and within ACPPA it's a perfect opportunity to chat with someone and sort of, see that you aren't alone. You might be feeling alone in your school at that point in time, but you're not alone at the end of the day. There's so many people out there to help and support and offer solutions, or just have a good old whinge with.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's the factor I always love talking about, which is the time limit in your partner's eyes. There's always like an amount of time where you can kind of debrief, but I feel like there's a glaze that comes over. I know for my wife, Liz, in different times, where you just go, you know what? I think I'm hitting my limit of allowable partner debrief time. And so that's the great thing about ACPA, right? When you're chatting with other principals, and they understand what you're going through, and you don't have to also, you don't hit that same time limit that you get with your partner, who you're trying to not just debrief everything with all day, every day.
Yeah, and my husband's not in education, and I've got 4 amazing children as well who went to school but are sick of hearing about it by the time they come home. Right. And out of 8 children in my family, 6 are teachers. So,
oh my goodness.
I have a lot of resources to be able to chat to, but the husband and the children, you're right, Jonno, their eyes glaze over like, no, I'm done now.
Yeah. I know if it gets faster, the glazing over time. It's anyway.
I think it does.
My 2.5-year-old, his eyes don't glaze over, but at the same time, if I tell him things, I'm not sure how much he understands. So he usually runs off and goes and plays with the next piece of Duplo. So we're working on that dynamic. Okay, let's talk about your story. I'm really excited to ask you about your childhood and growing up. What is one or a couple of moments that come to mind that really shaped you to be the leader you are today?
As I've said, I grew up in that small country town where community was a really important feature of being around. And in my own leadership, I've always tried to build that sense of community within the school context or within different associations I've worked within. So I think those formative years of being in a really strong community have really helped my own leadership. in terms of making sure that there's trust, there's relationship building, all those things that we hear about are really good elements of being a good leader. There are also elements of building a strong community. And so whilst there's not been a pivotal point of that was the time that I knew I could do leadership, I think I'm drawing on all those things that go to building a good community, because that's what leadership is at the end of the day. It's building a community and having the courage and confidence to be able to lead it.
Yeah, 100%. Actually, you reminded me of something that I've been thinking a lot about recently, which is when it comes to conflict management. I can't remember where I heard it, but someone made the point that, thousands of years ago, or even let's be honest, even hundreds of years ago, most of us, most humans, were living in small communities. And so the idea of having a significant conflict where in 2024, today you can walk away, you can leave the school if you're working there, or you can leave that social group, whatever it is. That wasn't really an option back then. Like, it was one of the options, but it was a massive deal to leave a community that I don't think we even can get our heads around. But I think you've experienced the modern equivalent of growing up in, what's been historically the case, where you were in this town of 200. So I guess my question for you is, and as someone who didn't grow up in a small community, I'm fascinated by how the community handled challenging people or significant broken relationships. How did the community you grew up in navigate those things? And I guess not always perfectly, but I'm really interested.
As you were saying that, Jonno, I actually can't remember too many big conflicts. I think everyone just chose to get along or ignore or, just get over things very quickly. And perhaps that's more an indication of how society's changed over the last 50 years rather than how conflict is handled. It's the old adage that we came home when the street lights came on and, someone would feed you after school, and it just happened. I really don't remember, apart from, growing up with 7 siblings, gosh, there was some interesting conflicts there at times, Jonno. But, yeah, I think more society has changed. I wonder how those small communities handle those situations now as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I guess it's the perspective of the people involved. And if back then, like you said, and I imagine over history as well, there was a real sense that for many things that happened, you would say whatever you needed to say, but you knew that you were turning up again tomorrow because that's where you lived, and that was your people. There wasn't anyone else. So and maybe, hopefully as well, maybe the community you grew up in was a really healthy community as well.
Yeah, and I think it still is. I still have contact. You see it all coming through the Facebook feeds and everything, that it seems to still have that really strong sense of community, which is wonderful. That's what people need.
When you see a school that's struggling with community, when you're chatting with a principal, an ACPPA who is really feeling like they're lacking buy-in from teachers or parents, not from one, but really, and they're coming to you saying, oh, how do I really bring people together to build and foster that sense of community? What's your perspective on that?
Go to the people who know the story of that place, whether it's the leadership team or someone on the school board. In a Catholic school, it might be the parish priest, but get the sense of the story of the place, because that's where you have to start. Everyone's got a story, every school's got a story, and while that story can change, it's really important that that story is honoured. And coming in as a leader into a new environment, or even in the same environment but the staff change, it's important to keep that story floating through. And we've seen that in cultures around the world for thousands and thousands of years, the continuation of stories of the place. So I think as a leader, you have to honour that, but also as a leader, you have to be vulnerable and show your own vulnerabilities in saying, look, help me understand what it is that this place means to you, so that I can get some sense of that as well.
That's so good, and it's such a great point about the founding story. I find that when I'm working with organizations around their why as part of understand, like one of my favorite things to do, and the ultimate, if it's ever possible, is to bring someone in who was part of that. So you get a lot of schools where you still have, particularly if they're 30 or 40 years old, you still have some of the people, often parents from the time, who might have built that school. Here in Australia, that's really common. People went, particularly with the independent and private schools, and there was some need that they saw, and there were often these amazing sacrificial stories. And if you can find one of those people and get them in the room with you, but also with the team, and capture some of that story, not only do you understand, it gives you those aha moments, but it does really connect you to that. There's always something. I always believe the founding story has like a seed of the vision and the mission of a place in it, and so that's such great advice.
And it is really important that schools change uniform, they change their logos, but to keep that inherent belonging that comes with the original story, it's so important to not throw that out as change goes through the school.
Yeah, so true. So, in your story, as you think back to growing up, tell us a little bit more of the kind of the timeline of how you ended up in teaching.
So, as I said, I've got some older siblings who went into teaching, so it seemed a natural progression. And I went to the Catholic University in Ballarat, now a branch of ACU. It was called Aquinas College then. And started my teaching in country Victoria, and I loved it. And then after a few years, my husband got the opportunity to move to Darwin, and so up I moved to Darwin the following year and started work in a really wonderful school community. It was actually the school that I ended up becoming principal of. So it was a really nice story. I had some fantastic role models in that environment. People I'm still in contact with today, and we still talk about, the tough times, the fun times, and how good it is that we've got that as a shared background, I guess. For a little while, we went and lived overseas, lived in Jakarta, and then moved back to Darwin. And, we're very settled here, and I'm really lucky to be able to stay here and continue in the EO role of ACPPA, because I've got that sense of, the Australia-wide context, but also the advocacy for rural, regional and remote education, which is a real challenge for, the northern and sort of central part of Australia.
Yeah, it must be great. There must be, I'm sure everyone, like you said, in your role, you're wanting to give everyone a voice, but I can imagine it must be really lovely for those in a rural setting to actually see someone in a leadership role who understands their situation.
Yeah, and I hope to provide that too in my role. I've whilst I haven't worked in a remote context myself, I certainly have had lots of engagement with those communities. And people are people no matter where they are, and everyone deserves the same chance, regardless of your geographic postcode.
So let's talk about one of your mentors, maybe from that school. I wonder if there are any specific stories that come to mind for you from one of those role models and how they handled a situation that kind of stuck with you as something you'll tuck away and you've used in your own way in leadership.
Interestingly, two of the principals that I worked for, when the principal's position came up that I was successful in getting, they both sent me the same piece of scripture, which was one of those moments that was like, well, hang on, there's a message in here. And so I think that piece of scripture has stayed dear to my heart in anything else I've done. And those two leaders, we laugh about it often about, I said, was this a setup? Did you both choose to send that? And it was quite independent. So
Wow.
I have a little saying, Jonno, that God doesn't whisper. And so it was obviously a big shout out and smack across the head. The scripture was for I know the plans I have for you. Yes, it was that piece of scripture. So it was interesting that they both knew me well enough to know that would resonate with me as well. And they were both amazing leaders that, whilst there was probably no, as you said before, an aha moment as such, the way that they built community, the way they connected with their staff and were vulnerable, all those things I've already mentioned, I still see in those two leaders.
So you were in the setting where you were working as a teacher, and then you ended up principal in that same setting.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know, one of the biggest challenges I hear from principals who go through that experience is it can be challenging around navigating friendship and being a peer or a colleague to then being a leader of the same people you've been working with. How did you find that transition?
Yeah, it was tricky. And also for the students in the school to see Mrs. Mulvahil's not the classroom teacher or doing that semi-leadership role anymore. She's now the principal. It did take some time, but I was fortunate in the school. The principal before me had set up good leadership structures and had encouraged leadership from all the staff. So the biggest jump for me was to the administrative side of things, was probably the biggest change, because the school had been set up so well in terms of its community, its structures, its routines. So that part didn't have to change too much. But for me, the biggest hurdle was that administrative load that comes with being a principal.
And as part of that, do you mean time management and how to execute all of those different things that are now required of you, or is, when you say administrative load, is it something else?
Something else as well. I trained to be a teacher, and then suddenly I'm doing budgets and HR and all those things that it literally is on the job training. You can do some courses and you have wonderful support from your system, but at the end of the day, it's new. And when you're learning something new, often you might take time to sit and process it and work it out. Well, you don't have the luxury of time when you're in the principal's role. That's why it's so great to see a lot of areas around the country now doing are you thinking about becoming a principal sort of program, and doing some pre-principal professional learning, so that there's a bit more awareness of all those extra things that you don't know that you're going to get lumped with once you step into that leadership position.
Yeah, it is a full-on, because the responsibility leading a school with all the different heavy burdens that are, like you mentioned, around HR and budget and finance. Did you find, in your experience, do you get much of a window into that in the kind of executive roles where you're not the principal, or is it just a fact that you don't really see it for what it is until you're the one who steps into the shoes to hold it?
In my situation, I didn't realise until I got into the role. The previous principal, I was on the leadership team, and so a lot of what's going on, but the nuts and bolts of how many children can be in that class for the next year and how many staff do you have to have, all of that was sort of discussed before it came to our leadership team. So we saw the shiny, glossy version, not the the frantic scrawlings on a piece of paper or on the whiteboard or whatever it might be that goes into that content before it gets produced to the staff. So all that background sort of stuff. And I always laugh, Jonno, that I married an accountant because of my financial expertise. So then coming into that situation too, when you've trained to teach, and a lot of own professional learning, a lot of support is needed to be able to navigate all the bits. And then just when you think you're getting somewhere, something new comes in and the sales change direction. So it's an ongoing process.
Yeah, being a principal, I think, is such a challenging role today. Incredibly rewarding, but I just think it really does push a lot of the limitations, or forces you to make sure, if you want to be an effective principal, you really do need to, if you have a weakness around things like time management or people management, that may not show. That was my experience as a leader anyway. I haven't been a school principal. I'm not an educated background, but I definitely found that there were things that I didn't know about myself or my own weaknesses in leadership, that maybe I had an idea that was there, but it was only when I was actually in a position where the rubber hit the road and I was trying to, mediate between two people who were struggling with something, or trying to manage different personalities I hadn't really led before, that I found out, oh my goodness, okay, there's something here that I don't know that other people do know. What do you see? Is there, I guess this is one of those questions, is there any way for a leader to walk into that, like to do the pre-principle work? Can we set them up completely, or can we just do it to the best we can and know that people are always going to have to find out some of it on the job?
Yeah, I don't think there's ever going to be a 100% we've got this covered. Being a leader, I think you need to have a really big toolkit that you can reach into and try different things, knowing that what you tried and was successful yesterday isn't going to work tomorrow, because it might be different children or different staff or different situations. So being able to adapt to the needs of each situation, and using your experience or what you've read or listened to, or someone has coached you through, is really important to be able to apply those. But I think even more so is to surround yourself with great people who have got your back regardless. And you might have a closed door conversation afterwards about what was that about, but in the absolute height of a situation, that you're going to support each other regardless. You'll have each other's back. And I was very fortunate that I did have strong leadership teams, particularly in the last few years, a really good leadership team and other good leaders within the school that you knew you could turn to in a situation if need be.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so important. And what about in your time as a principal? I think you said 8 years.
Yeah.
You were a principal. Any aha moments that come to mind from where it sticks with you about a situation you had to navigate, or something you learnt about leadership from those 8 years that stands out for some reason?
Not so much an aha moment, but what I loved about learning in leadership was the new leaders to the leadership team, or aspiring leaders, who would question, well, why are you doing that, Gez? Or why is that the situation? And it made me really reflect on things that I might have not reflected on for a little while. So that was really good for my own leadership when I had to then explain it to someone else. And because you get into a routine and it's what you do, but knowing why you're doing it and reflecting again on why you're doing something was a really good element of our leadership team, that we talked about why things were happening.
Yeah, I think what I see leaders struggle with in that area is, the more power you have, the more responsibility you have, the more you can create and have control over who you have around you. And I think, it's really easy to say, I want people to be able to question me. I want to have that environment where people can push back. But, and I've seen this before. I've seen, a leader who says, I want people to question me. But then in a meeting when someone questions it, they shut it down. And they don't do it intentionally. It's just kind of the way they react, or they try to move on and kind of say, oh, don't have time to talk about that. Let's keep going. But they, then the kind of thing that I've had to give them feedback on or work together on is to say, look, you say you want people to ask why and to give them a voice, but when they actually do, without realizing it, you're actually not empowering that voice, which is sending them the message that you don't want them to say why. And so lining up what you want with actually creating that environment. What did you find most helpful in setting up an environment where your newer leadership team members did feel safe to actually ask why and push back on things in a healthy way?
Yeah, it's a good point you raised too, Jonno, because there were times I certainly would have been that person shutting things down, because you don't always get it right as a leader, and knowing that it's okay to say, oh, I got that wrong, is really important. With our leadership team, we had daily check-ins, so you'd sort of read the room of what people were going like in their leadership. Everyone has bad days, or might have something going on, or we'd realise that, it's really hectic, we've got staff away. So we'd have a few minutes catch up every single morning, so that we made eye contact, we spoke with one another, we smiled, whether we wanted to or not. And it was a really good way to start the day. Sometimes it was more than a 5-minute catch up, depending on what was going on. But the other thing we built in was we called it the tap out. So if we knew we weren't handling a situation very well, whether it's a child's behaviour, we couldn't explain ourselves very well, we gave each other the permission to tap out and just say, I'm out, I can't do it. And someone would come in and pick it up from where it was going. And I said the word vulnerability earlier, and I think you have to be able to do that and not believe that you've got the answer to everything. And, there were times you'd walk into a room and you really wouldn't know what was going on, and your colleague is tapping out, you're trying to pick up the mood and the vibe, but it might only be a 10 seconds. I just need 10 seconds to take a breath and get myself together again and come back. And so that was a really important feature in our leadership team, that we knew that it was safe to do that. Because when you're in the height of the moment, that's when you might say, no, I don't want you to question me. What you talked about, having that fine line between, yes, I'm open, but not right now. So being able to tap out, huge part of our leadership team.
I love that. I love the tap out idea, because I think one of the biggest challenges, or probably one of my biggest learnings for myself as a leader, is how things can trigger me. And you want it to be, you want rational Jonno. I want rational Jonno to turn up 100% of the time. And I'm working on learning more about myself so that rational Jonno turns up more than irrational Jonno in those moments of heightened moments, right? But we all have moments where sometimes it's not as much to do with us in terms of that moment, but maybe there's been a build-up. Maybe I've just come from a situation that was actually extremely high pressure. For a principal, maybe they've just come out of a half day dealing with an incredibly intense situation, or one of the team, and they walk into another situation, and to actually realize, oh my goodness, I am actually not at my best for a second. I need someone else to just have this moment so I can collect myself and gather my thoughts. That is so genius, because I love the permission giving. It's actually giving people permission to say, when you sense that, that's okay, tap out, and someone else who's not feeling that can step in and help you. And then in the right time, the reverse will happen as well.
And it also offers that really good opportunity for a discussion afterwards about what it was that was the challenge, or, to be able to share, hey, I tried this idea, it worked, it might not work next time, but to be able to have that feedback opportunity afterwards was always really good as well.
Particularly for educators with parents, because I think there's always a parent, from what I've learned from educators, there are some people that are better in general with dealing with parents and student behavior. Some of it might come more naturally. They've had more time of experience, but there is often, it seems to be, there's often a parent or a type of parent engagement that for some leaders, just for some reason, really flusters them. And it's actually, you might know that you're usually really good with that, but actually there's something about this engagement that's just really, you're like you said, you just want to make sure you say the right thing and don't in the heat of the moment say something really poor form, or unhelpful or even hurtful. So I think, and that's so true for leaders in every other part of life. I think we've all had those moments where we think, I definitely have, where I've thought, why on earth is this getting under my skin so much? Like, I feel like there's other things that don't. This is really, like, I'm just not my best right now. And afterwards, let's reflect. But right now, I just need to be able to tap out and get someone else who is part of my team, who I know can tap in and actually help with that. So yeah, I love that, Gez. That's so good.
Not my idea. We got it from someone else, Jonno, but it really works successfully without that.
This is also the challenge of 230-ish episodes from the podcast now, because what I find is I have so many amazing ideas like that, and then I go to reference them at some point, and I do find that even in the show today, I think I mentioned, I think someone on the podcast shared this kind of story, and sometimes I get it right with referencing it, but I feel like I'll be bringing that one up again. Tap out. I'll remember Gez Mulvahil.
I can highly recommend
Gez Mulvahil used it. Yeah, that's right. I also love the daily check-in. I think this has actually been a real theme for me recently, is talking to school principals about the power of being at the gate in the morning, and a very unique setting. I was chatting with a leader who's a CEO with 700 staff, all remote, the other day, and we were laughing about how much he wishes he had a gate where everyone came through every day. It's like, in some ways, that thing which for schools you can be like, oh, for him that would be a dream. Instead, he's just got this group that he has to bring together from. But it is, and so I'm connecting that to the daily check-in, because I think, I'm not saying every principal should be at the gate every day, but I think what I've learned about that behavior is you're often having little 2-minute conversations and 2-minute connections with students, teachers, and parents that that puts out fires when they're just at that kindling stage. It's just, they're starting to flame up, and you're able to douse, through a great little conversation, rather than only seeing them when they end up in your office and they've all, they're kind of like a full blaze by then. And so the daily check-in, for me, I think it kind of does that with a team. I think you catch those little scheduling admin, why, how you going, are you okay, like, those moments before having to kind of realize 3 days later that it's become something more significant. Does that make sense for you? Was that your experience with the daily check-in?
Absolutely. And especially when we were putting so much trust in each other in terms of that tap out, that you needed to know that, you'd get the vibe if someone's feeling a bit down, or they're a bit sick, or, they've come back from a trip or something, that they may not have been your first tap out option because of stuff that was going on, or, they might have said, I've got a really heavy class load at the moment. Can I be further down the list, sort of, to be able to, triage the tapping out tree. But it was really good to say hello to each other and to connect. And I tried to do that with all staff, not always possible, and it's different for me in my current role, because I work from home on my own. And so having those daily check-ins is part of something I miss, I guess, about being in a school, because I'm used to having that connection. And whilst I can still connect, can talk, and I can Zoom with people, but it's different than having that face-to-face connection to start my day each day.
Yeah, and I'd really love to challenge listeners. I find when I talk about this with people, and I can imagine the listeners who are in whatever context, different context, remote work, where they're in a team. It's different, like yourself, where you're the executive officer leading something by yourself, but they're in any kind of team where there's multi-campus, or it's not a school and they're remote, or one of their leadership team is in another country sometimes, and it's always a case of, oh, this wouldn't work for us. But I really want to challenge people, listening, to try to find a way to do the daily check-in if you're a part of a team, because even if it's a case of a standing time slot where you try to connect over Zoom for 10 minutes, you keep it short. And if people can't make it, that's fine. That'll happen. But everyone who can make it turns up and just does. I love Patrick Lencioni's framework for the daily check-in. I love that, which is a great place to start. So yeah, if anyone's listening going, oh, that's great, but no, it wouldn't work for me, I would just challenge you, give it a try with your team for 2 weeks. And it's funny how it feels insignificant in some ways, but then you notice things there's a real things that were kind of getting in the way, or things were a bit bumpy in the team. It's like they kind of clear out, and it just gives you more momentum. That's my experience.
Yeah, and it really helps build that team. And teams have to be worked on. You can't just build it and then go, that's it. You have to keep working to keep the team cohesive. So yeah, I'd encourage people to have a go at it too.
Okay, this has been too much fun, because look at the time, Gez, but I'm going to ask you the Leadership Express questions. So first thing that comes to mind for these questions, I know you have listened to the podcast, so you know what some of them will be. The first one is, what book have you gifted the most to others?
Well, I must be a terrible person, Jonno, because I don't gift books, but I recommend. So I've gifted one book in all my years, and I gave the same book to all of my leadership team, which was The Act of Leadership by Dan Hasler. So that was the one book I have gifted. The book that counts. Yeah, it does count. So I have tipped. I've done something right. The one I recommend the most, though, is a book called The Pope and the CEO, and it's by Andreas Widmer. And so he was a Swiss guard and worked for Pope John Paul II as a Swiss guard. And so obviously listened to a lot of the work that Pope John Paul II was doing. And then when he left the Swiss Guard, he went into the corporate world, and so uses a lot of those lessons about what he learnt from the Pope and how he applies those into the corporate world. So it's a book I go back in and out of.
Ooh, I love it.
You know, I've read it cover to cover a couple of times, but it's also something that I might think, oh, that's really challenging for me at the moment. And working in Catholic communities, scripture forms a really big part of that for us. So to be able to find something that I can then share with others or use as a bit of self-motivation, it's the book that I go to the most.
That's an awesome recommendation. I'm definitely going to check that out. I love that story. I'm fascinated, and I think the leadership role of the Pope and learning from the Pope and then applying that in the corporate world. Wow, I'm really fascinated. So I'll definitely add that. I'll add that to my list. What about podcasts or any books you're reading or blogs? Anything you're just really loving right now? It doesn't have to be education specific. It can be just great content that you've come across.
Well, obviously, this podcast, Jonno, is high on my rotation list. So, also The Habits of Leadership by Dan Hasler. And I don't listen to too many podcasts other than those. And I'm also, in my reading, I very rarely will read a leadership book front to back. That's why I like books that I can tap in and out of as well. So another one that I really love reading for bits and pieces is When the Adults Change, Everything Changes by Paul Dix. And it's about changing as a leader in a school, not expecting the children to do the changing, but for the adults to change their behaviours to then model to the students in the school that that's how things are done. So, they're good ones that I love to pick up and put down every now and then. I'm also reading A Long Way Home by Saru Brearley. I heard him speak at a conference earlier in the year, so his story fascinated me. And so now when I'm reading the book, it's like a paperback book, not the audio. I am hearing his voice read it to me because I listened to his story, which really sort of jagged the emotion in me when I heard him speak, and I hunted and hunted to be able to find his book and was very successful.
Oh, okay. Yeah, another great recommendation. Thank you. What about a great piece of advice? Can you think of a time where you received a great piece of advice from someone?
Yeah, it's a 2-word piece of advice. It's go gently. And I learned it from a deputy principal who worked on my team, and it means so much because it's go gently with yourself, with others, in your workload, in your family life. It can be applied in so many different contexts. And, you know, when you feel your heart rate rising as you're walking into a meeting or after a meeting, when you've had the adrenaline pumping, and using it as a bit of a mantra of go gently works for me, and it can be applied in so many contexts. And I love that I learnt it from someone who was new to our leadership team.
Yeah, I love that too. Go gently. That's such a great thing to be saying when you're in those high pressure moments and just in high pressure life moments too.
Yeah.
What's a big struggle or problem that you see school principals are facing today?
I think the complexities of the job, and we see so much being thrown into schools, like, oh, we'll add that to the school curriculum, we'll add that, schools can pick that up. And schools are flat out picking up everything that they already are. And so the principal is flat out, but the principal also needs to support the teachers in the school, then the families and the students. And there's so many different roles that a principal has to play. I used to refer to as code switching. I'd be with a teacher who's got stuff going on in their classroom, and then you'd go to a parent who was upset, or then you're being told you've funding's cut. So you're going from every so often from change to change. You just had to switch really quickly, and that builds up your adrenaline. You're constantly in that sort of hyper-vigilant mode of what next. So to have all of those things loaded on the principal really does impact principal well-being, and I know we hear about it a lot, but it is a real thing. It's not just rhetoric. It is something that there's got to be a significant shift in supporting the principals, because who's coming next? You look over your shoulder and who's there to pick up the principal's role. So something needs to be done, and I'm really proud that I work with an association who has that at the forefront of their mind as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the thought that comes to mind for me is, as a society and as a parent now of Roman, and I'm catching myself doing, I think I can see how parents create expectations of schools from the parent perspective that can be unhelpful, and as a society. But when someone leaves a job and they've been in a workplace wherever, and they've been working and working, and they've asked for raises or for less of a workload for a couple of years, and then they finally decide to quit and they leave, and then the place hires 3 people to replace them. I feel like that if we're not careful, that's what it's going to be for society with school principals, because right now there is a principal shortage, but I don't think it's as bad as it could get. And my concern is that, like you say, the complexity, maybe we just need to be careful that we don't allow it to get to that point where actually it's gotten so bad in the next 10 to 15 years as a society that we finally at that point go, oh, okay, so we've only got 1 principal for every 2 jobs. Maybe we need to do something about that. So I really do hope as a broader society that we can pick this up earlier than other countries are, and do something about it to do whatever we have to do to make the principal job doable and for them to be supported. I hope we can, and I love the work that you're doing in that space.
Yeah, and the principal's job is so rewarding that we want to keep principals loving their job and encouraging other people to come in and love the job as well.
It's a real parallel to the teacher shortage in terms of, I now look at, I've shared this before on the podcast, but I look back at myself in high school and I think, what was it that Jonno White didn't see in teaching? Because there's something in the narrative in society here in Australia about teaching that now that I understand it, I go, oh my goodness, I should have been seeing that as one of the most significant things that you can do in your life for work and meaningful, and yet I didn't. And so I think we have a lot of work to do around the narrative of the significance and the importance and the meaning that people can get from teaching and from being a principal.
Yeah, absolutely. And the impact you have on others, and the responsibility is great, but so is the reward.
I agree. What's a commonly held belief in your industry that you disagree with?
Ooh.
I'm putting you on the spot with this one.
Teachers get 10 weeks holiday a year, 12 weeks holiday a year. Yes, they may have time that's not face to face, but it's the old joke, isn't it? Oh, but teachers, you have all that time off. But a lot of that time is used for planning, and let's face it, teachers have to pay the highest price for airfares because they always have to go in school holiday time, Jonno. So
that's true. That's true. Yes, it is.
There's probably a few misconceptions, but it's probably best I keep them to myself before I get too passionate and keep you talking.
I know, I can see you weighing them up. I can see, if anyone wants to know what was coming into her head that she didn't want to share publicly because of wisdom, you might have to contact her individually and find out.
Maybe I should have just passed that question.
She's using wisdom to go gently and not to ruffle feathers of anyone. I like that. Okay, a bit of fun. A movie or TV show that really impacted you?
Oh, Ted Lasso, for sure. Amazing show. I'm not a soccer fan, but the messages and the leadership messages that came from that show, but a really good part of it for me was one of my siblings would watch it, and then we'd both be texting each other and, what about this bit? And so it was a really good connection between our family as well.
That's so awesome. Yeah, I love Ted Lasso too, and I'm a massive soccer fan. So for me, that part of it as well, I follow the Premier League really closely, and so it was just like the ultimate show: leadership and Premier League soccer. Yeah, I really did love it. So I agree. Okay, last question: if you could only give one piece of leadership advice to a young leader, what would you say?
Well, I would say go gently because that's my go-to, but I would also say to enjoy it, admit your mistakes, don't pretend to have all the answers because you're not going to, and you're going to mess it up. Own it, laugh at it. I have good laughs about some monumental mistakes I've made, so you've just got to move on and but to really enjoy every moment that you can because it's easy to focus on the negative, so focus on the positives.
Such great advice. I think it applies as well for, like I said, for leaders, but also someone who runs a small business, running a consultancy. I think it's the same thing. It really is. It's easy in the middle of growing things, and when you're dealing with obstacles, to focus on those. But it is such a good message to stop and actually make sure you're appreciating, celebrating the small wins. Not getting carried away with the mistakes. Like you said, we all have made them. We all do make them. And go gently on yourself.
Yes.
So, Gez, where can people find you if they'd like to find out more about ACPPA and about you?
So you can head to the ACPPA website. ACPPA is the best acronym to use, or the longer version, Australian Catholic Primary Principals Association. You can find me on LinkedIn or have a Google, Gez Mulvahil. I'm sure there's not many of us around the world, so I'll probably pop up as a top search item. So, yeah, feel free to get in contact with me if you've got any questions about the role of the principal or how you can help support principals in their roles as well.
Amazing. Well, I want to thank our listeners for tuning in. Such a fun episode, and just learning about Gez, the youngest of 8 siblings growing up in a community with 200 people. That was, just so many highlights of the episode. And I definitely have that 2-word phrase, go gently, stuck in my head, which I think everyone around me is going to be hearing about, whether they like it or not, the next few months, as happens after these podcasts. And most of all, I want to say a big thank you to you, Gez, for being so generous with your time, sharing some great stories and just giving us a bit of an insight into the world for those who aren't in education of the principal. And I think as well, I think I found it really encouraging, some of the things you've shared. Not only go gently, but that going, in terms of not taking those mistakes too much to heart. I think there'd be a lot of listeners who maybe are going through something, and something today would have really encouraged them. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Jonno. And you go gently in your next few days too.